For more than 20 years, Asia has had the world's lowest airfares. It wasn't hard to find a short international flight for less than $100, and you could even get some long haul bargains too. But that's fast changing.
And especially now with the war, like going to Europe, in the past, you could easily, if you looked out for promos, you'd be able to find something from maybe $800 to $1,000 for a round trip. Now that's like a one-way fare.
The price of jet fuel spiked after the war in Iran started in February, and they remain higher than they were before the conflict. Budget airlines, the so-called low-cost carriers, are particularly vulnerable. So we're asking, are the glory days of cheap travel over? I'm Mariko in Singapore, and this is Asia Pacific from the BBC World Service. Twice a week, we bring you Asia Pacific stories, unpacked by those who know them best. I have two aviation experts with me in the studio. Shukor Yusuf is the founder of Endow Analytics. Welcome to Asia Pacific.
Thank you.
I also have Brendan Savey, an independent analyst and consultant. Thank you so much for coming on the pod.
Thank you.
So firstly, we're looking at budget airlines today because jet fuel is back in the news headlines. I mean, we've been talking about it on and off since the war in Iran started. But maybe, Shukor, you can paint the picture for our audience how that's been affecting Asian airlines, particularly low-cost carriers.
Well, first of all, I think even before February 28, when the war started in Iran, low-cost carrier was only in name only because of what happened during COVID, and then post-COVID, things changed very fundamentally.
So name only as in...
Name only, I think it's low cost, but it's not exactly low cost. I would say it's not exactly premium, but it's gone up quite a bit. You know, those days when you can fly from Singapore to Bangkok for a jug of beer or something, those days are gone when AirAsia said. But now it's very different. You pay everything for ancillary for stuff on board, and then they try to squeeze everything out of you.
What do you think in terms of this higher jet fuel prices? What's been the impact, and why are budget carriers more vulnerable compared to like legacy carriers?
Low-cost carriers still have lower costs than full-service airlines. Their costs have increased post-pandemic, but they're still a relatively lower cost, and fares are still relatively lower. That means that for a budget airline, their fuel cost is a higher portion of total cost. So anytime fuel cost goes up, it hits them harder because of the portion of total cost, but also the type of passenger they have is harder to get them to absorb that additional cost because they tend to be price-sensitive passengers. The full-service airlines have a lot of premium passengers, a lot of people who can afford the additional airfare from higher fuel, but a budget airline struggles. They if they push up the fare too much, which is sometimes what happens, including recently, is they have fewer passengers and then they have to cut capacity. So you either have to absorb losses either way. So they're really kind of in between a rock and a hard place.
I actually spoke to a travel blogger, Jacqueline. So let's hear what she had to say in terms of how much she's noticed about the price hike.
So I started my travel blog, The Occasional Traveler, in 2010. Currently today, I think I've gone to about 58 countries, last that I counted. If you do a lot of pre-planning and you give a lot of time before you actually travel, you can usually look out for some pretty good deals. But yes, overall, I feel that long-haul flights especially, those travel prices have gone up quite a lot in recent years. And especially now with the war, like going to Europe, in the past, you could easily, if you looked out for promos, you'd be able to find something from maybe $800 to $1,000 for a round trip. Now that's like a one-way fare. A lot of my friends do loyalty programs, miles hacking. If you have the time and energy to research into that, you can get very good deals out of hacking your miles and your credit cards and making full use of these loyalty programs.
So she says that she can still find deals in Asia, but Shukor, you disagree that those deals are really a lot harder to find these days?
Indeed, I think, and she's also referring to miles and loyalty and all that stuff, which most discount budget carriers don't offer.
Yeah, because I was going to ask, when you say, if jet fuel prices account for a much bigger portion of those airlines' costs, why is that? So legacy carriers make money and have bigger costs of other things other than jet fuel, Brendan?
budget carrier fares are cheaper, but the price of fuel is the same for all airlines, so it's disproportionately more. And I do think you can get discounts, particularly regionally. Europe is very hard, has been since the war. But for regional travel, there are still a lot of cheap fares, and it depends where you look. I mean, some markets more than others. And you can still, if you look at the base fare, there is still a lot of base fares for a jug of beer around the region. I mean, but the problem is that taxes are very high, particularly from Singapore. So you people to see, oh my, it's going to cost me $100 to get to Bangkok. One way, but the base fare might be $1. So it's and this really still happens now, even when you fly tomorrow, especially in an off-peak time of year. On those routes that have the competition, you can get base fares of $1, and that's why some of these low-cost carriers are not making very much money. And there's fuel surcharges as well, of course, which is another area to try to offset the fuel prices. But a consumer will look at the total price. They won't look at how much Changi Airport is getting, how much the fuel surcharge is, how much whatever other taxes and fees are. They don't. But when you take all those away, you're left with $1. How can an airline make money on $1? Of course they can't.
I mean, Brendan talked about fuel surcharges. So when prices go up, do carriers always pass that on to passengers? Because I thought, most carriers would use a strategy called fuel hedging, where they buy bulk when prices are cheaper.
None of the budget carriers in this
region
hedge. The European budget carriers hedge, but they hedge the budget carriers in this region do not hedge.
No hedge, no.
So that they don't have that lever. They don't have that.
But why don't they hedge? I mean, that seems like a smart thing to do.
Hedging is very expensive, number one. It's very, very expensive, and you have to have a very solid balance sheet.
Yeah.
And then you go into collaterals, you have collars and whatever options. It's derivatives, basically.
Some countries you can't hedge either because there's restrictions. Chinese carriers don't hedge because of Chinese restrictions.
It's gambling, basically, right?
And airlines have gotten burned from hedging too over the years. And the other big difference is the budget carriers in this region sit on a very price-sensitive market. I mean, Singapore is an exception, and Scoot's an exception because they're under Singapore Airlines Group. But almost all the other budget airlines in this region, they sit in a very price-sensitive market.
Yeah, they live from hand to mouth, basically. Unlike Scoot.
And they don't have the balance sheet. But in the U.S., for example, the airlines talk openly about keeping fares high, even as fuel prices come back down. Maybe they'll go back up again. But they will, they see the demand is sufficient to not bring back the prices so fast. But in Asia, it's a little different. Most of these Southeast Asian economies, except for Singapore, they're just so price sensitive, and you cannot pass on the cost, and you can't keep those fares high when the fuel costs come down. And the other thing with this particular crisis too, the fuel prices went up very fast, right? So it's just even for an airline in the U.S. And the U.S. carriers are, unlike European carriers, tend to be not hedged. They have the pricing power now, but for it's so fast that they did lose money in that first month or so because it takes time to. Everybody had already purchased their ticket. The lead time. You can't tell somebody flying tomorrow you have to pay more now. So it is difficult, especially when the fuel prices goes up as quickly as it did. It overnight it almost tripled. So it's
we saw the U.S. low-cost carrier Spirit that went under partly because of this.
And also, I think partly because the business model of Spirit. I don't know if you'll agree with it, but it's ultra low cost. Which is more similar to Ryanair than you would with AirAsia or Lion Air, for example, right? But here it's mostly the typical low-cost carrier, like they charge you for everything. But with ultra low cost, it's really, really stringent, right? With
very
everything.
Basic,
yeah.
What is the difference between what you described as ultra low carrier versus low-cost carrier? What do they do differently? What's the difference in the business model?
Well, they keep very basic stuff. I mean, you can fly for €5 from London to Costa del Sol or whatever the case may be, and then that's it. And everything else, and luggage is very strictly enforced, right? But here, I mean, I've flown several low-cost carriers here, and they're very flexible. I mean, even if they say it's 7 kilos and all that with onboard luggage and all that, but you can get away with 10. So I hope
Well,
you don't check my
well,
Not
with
anymore.
Spirit, you couldn't even put a bag on the overhead
Yeah,
bin.
yeah,
You have to
exactly.
charge for that.
Yeah.
They
Oh,
were the
wow.
one. I think the first ones.
That's a good point, yeah.
Back when they were more successful under Ben Baldanza, who was this kind of guy who unfortunately passed
The,
away.
the late Bender, he was a good guy.
He really brought this ULCC ultra low cost carrier model, and it was quite successful for a few years. But I think it got dated, especially post COVID, with all these additional costs, and Spirit just didn't adjust to the times fast enough, and they were very weak already entering this crisis. They were twice into bankruptcy. Like within the last couple of years. So I mean, you don't get, this crisis doesn't kill any airline. It kills an airline that was already weak.
But in this part of the world, we saw the headline of Jetstar closing last year. I mean, are we thinking that another airline could go under in this part of the world?
That's the reason for that. I think Singapore
very
is a
specific.
very expensive place to run an airline, any airline. And even if you're an Australian airline, which is very well funded by Qantas and all that, but it's just day to day, it's just very expensive. And so I think after so many years of not making profit, I think they did the right thing by exiting. But low-cost carriers are also struggling now in the Philippines and other parts because the yields have shrunk, and the cost of money in these countries, the currencies in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in Malaysia, they've shrunk versus the greenback. So that if you're Air Asia or if you're Lion Air, then you see your costs are in US dollars, right? Fuel's US dollars, you're leasing the aircraft is US dollars, but your revenue income stream is in the local currency. How's that work? So
That's always an issue, yeah. But it's the smaller airlines that tend to fail. I mean, Spirit was a big airline, but they were small in the U.S. context, only a few % market share. The bigger airlines you never really see fail because they're too big for the economy, for the ecosystem. The government or some supplier will or suppliers will bail them out. Basically, will support them through thick and thin in order to keep them going because there's too much impact on the government and the economy and the suppliers if they go under. But smaller airlines, Jetstar Asia was a Singapore-based affiliate of Jetstar. They were quite small. Jetstar kind of pulled the plug on them, so that you can see more of that kind of example, where smaller affiliates of bigger groups go or smaller airlines, but you won't see a big airline usually fail, and including
you
in
don't
this
think
region.
so? No?
I mean, like
in other parts of ASEAN?
no, I mean you'll see the smaller ones fail. You won't if in Air Asia, for example, you won't see like Malaysia or Thailand fail because they're number one.
I'm saying low cost.
No, the Air Asia's a low-cost carrier, right?
Yeah, but it's not backed by the government.
Yeah, no, but it doesn't matter because they're number
Of course
one.
It matters. Because,
Well, but
governments are not going to allow if they have a stake in whether it's low cost, it's imperative for them to keep it.
they will bail out an Air Asia if necessary because the share of the market is their share of the market, their critical role in the economy.
I agree.
Is too important, and in fact, this is something that
yes.
could happen. What form of bailout is? It could be a loan. It doesn't have to be a stake. There would be some sort of measure.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I think Air Asia is a very good example of a privately run airline, but it is for many years it's been seen as de facto the national airline of Malaysia because it brings more tourists into Malaysia than does the national airline.
We've been talking about Air Asia, and in their most recent financial results, they did acknowledge that they're under quite a bit of cost pressure, didn't they? And they said that they have cut capacity in some routes. Also, they added a fuel surcharge in order to try and stay ahead of the cost curve. I mean, Brendan, you talked about how passengers in Asia are quite price conscious compared to the rest of the world. But compared to, during the pandemic, at least there's demand for traveling, right? Like people are still quite keen to travel in Asia compared to other parts of the world. Is that right?
I mean, I wouldn't say compared to other parts of the world, but you have a growing middle class in this part of the world. You have a young population, and what was happening is at least until recently was discretionary income. Middle class populations, they were on the rise, right? And these people had the money to start traveling. This was happening pre-COVID in a lot of the Southeast Asian countries. You had the rise of the middle class, increasing discretionary income, and expansion of budget carriers and lower fares. So it was like this perfect situation where both things were going in the right direction, and of course that was a recipe for very rapid growth of budget carriers in this region. But post-pandemic, what's happened is the costs are increasing, the fares are higher, they're not quite as low as they used to be. The cost of traveling is more for various reasons. And very recently, I would say there's pressure on discretionary income as well. If you look at a market like Indonesia, where they're, it's the economy hasn't been doing that well. And when price of fuel goes up, it doesn't only go up for airlines, it goes up for your bills at home too, right? So everything, transport, especially in a country like Indonesia, is expensive. So these people have less money to spend.
I was just reading an article, I think, from Bloomberg about the role of AI and how, it used to be that airlines might have human analysts to, decide whether to raise prices because there's strong demand or whatever. Now that's been replaced by maybe AI, that it's impossible for an ordinary human passenger to beat the system, beat the machine, and find that, potential rare bargain that we might have been able to find. What's your view on that?
So these AI-based revenue management tools help airlines improve their revenue management ability and maximize the profitability. But again, if demand is low, they're going to have to reduce the fares, in order to fill the seats, whether it's AI or a non-AI solution. It's still the supply and demand and economics 101 are still the same, right? So, but of course, these like mistake fares or, maybe fewer of those. So if these bloggers out there who are like expert at finding this rare deal, maybe some of those examples could be close to some extent.
Airfares in Asia, are they going to keep going up after the war, or are they going to go back to where they used to be?
No, here's this money.
Well, they're not going to go back to where they used to be. I mean, and what do you mean by used to be? Pre-war or pre-COVID?
Pre-COVID.
No way. Too many costs have gone up. If they go back to pre-COVID, then everybody loses. The airlines will go all out of business, and there'll be nobody to fly anyone anymore. So, that's never going to happen. But I think they will normalize to some extent, once we have some stability in the world, which could be 3 months from now or 3 years from now or 30 years from now, who knows, right? So in terms of airfares, it's all about supply and demand. Again, it's an economic thing. It's outside our control. Where airfares go, airlines, of course, want to raise fares, but it's about supply and demand. If demand goes down because economies are poor, they have to stimulate in order to just get the passenger on the plane, even if they're losing money. They don't want to lose money, but sometimes they have to lose money, like now, or in the last quarter, everyone's basically was losing money. And it's about competition, right? These airlines, they'll want to put the capacity back because they want to be. They're subscale now with all these capacity cuts, and they have overhead and too many people, and that will put pressure, on the fares in some markets more than others. But it's not going to come back to pre-COVID, and that's unrealistic. That should have never happened anyway. The fares were actually too low even pre-COVID because the competition was so high.
One of the things that we really need to understand, and people forget, but the cost of money in 2001. Post 9/11, when AirAsia became the first low-cost carrier in this part of the world, $50 then, it's very different from what the value is today. So please remember that.
I have to say, though, I'm so glad that I made the most of it in my 20s when the flights were really cheap and when I was still single and kidsless and I could fly everywhere.
You can say for all of us here.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me, Brendan and Shuko.
It's a pleasure speaking to you, Marika.
Thank you.
You've been watching Asia Pacific from the BBC World Service with me, Marika Ooi, in Singapore. If you have any questions or thoughts on what we covered in this episode or any other stories from the region, please leave us a comment below. You can also get in touch with us on email, asiapacific@bbc.co.uk, and click like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.